When this happened, I was around 12 years old living in a peaceful suburb in South Carolina. I would spend hours walking my dog around the neighborhood because there wasn't much else to do back then. We had a 70-pound Basset hound named Rufus. One afternoon as it started to get dark, I was walking Rufus in the neighborhood when I saw a beat-up rusty red pickup truck driving slowly around. First, I didn't think much of it. Living in the South, pickup trucks were common and it wasn't unusual to see them. However, as I walked home, I noticed the truck turning down different streets, looping around as if lost. The neighborhood wasn't set up like a typical grid with blocks, but rather had a main road with smaller streets branching off and circling. Back to it I continued walking, but as I got closer to my house I saw the truck again, this time parked on the side of the road. When I turned onto the street where my house was, I noticed the truck starting to move slowly behind me with its lights off. Basset hounds aren't exactly the most intimidating dogs. They're short and stout, resembling a big dachshund with floppy ears and goofy expressions. Even though Rufus was large, he wasn't built for protection. He walked slowly and would often trip over his ears if he tried to run, with Rufus almost as heavy as I was picking him up, and running wasn't an option there. I was walking down a dark road in a quiet neighborhood with a slow dog and a creepy truck following me. I knew I couldn't outrun it, and I doubted anyone would hear me scream. After a while I came up with a plan, a risky one. When I reached one of the few lamp posts on the street, I stopped and turned around, staring at the truck. Stopped. Two parked about 30 feet away from me, as if trying to look like it wasn't following. I stood there staring at the truck, which sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, probably just 2 or 3 minutes. Eventually the truck turned its lights on and slowly drove down another street. As soon as it was gone, I sprinted into someone's backyard and hurried home. I never told my mom about that strange truck because I knew she would worry and probably never let me take the dogs out alone again. When I was younger, I lived in the heart of a bustling city. Anyone who has lived there understands how small some apartments can be when space comes at such a high price. Landlords do their best to fit as many people as possible into limited rooms. Since I worked from home at the time, my desk and bed were the only furniture I owned. Since my apartment was so small that my bed was almost directly next to the front entrance, I couldn't afford much more since money was limited at the time. I stayed there for about 5 years, longer than most people in that building. My neighbors came and went frequently. Some were students, others were travelers from different countries. There were also a few families and a handful of young professionals. However, this story is about my worst neighbor. His name was Fred, and he was in his 50s. He was tall, though his poor posture made him seem more average in height. I imagine that if he stood up straight, he'd have been at least 6 feet 2 inches, and Fred had shoulder length gray hair and a bushy, untamed beard. He wore a plaid button-down shirt almost daily. When I first met Fred, I introduced myself and immediately felt uneasy. He appeared distant and unfriendly, as if even saying hello was a burden. He wouldn't share his name until I specifically asked. At first I brushed it off. Social situations aren't always my strong suit, so I thought perhaps I misread him, but what happened next made me uneasy. One afternoon I was sitting at my desk, which was beside my bed. Suddenly I heard someone walking toward my door. My apartment was at the end of the hall, so it wasn't common for anyone to pass by. I glanced up from my computer, curious about who it could be. Moments later I heard someone trying to open the door. There were a couple of shakes on the handle and a firm push. Thankfully I had locked the door. When they realized it was locked, they gave up. I sat there frozen for a few seconds, staring at the door. Slowly I got up and tiptoed to the peephole. The hallway appeared empty. Fred must have left. Still shaken, I waited a few more seconds before quietly cracking the door and peeking out. I saw Fred walking away with an empty duffel bag. I was seriously creeped out, especially since my bed was right next to that door. While having an actual bedroom would have provided more separation, there was something unsettling about how close he was while I slept, even though he couldn't get in. I talked to a few neighbors about Fred, and it turned out others had issues With him too. Apparently he had tried this before, going around trying to open doors in hopes they were left unlocked. Not many succeeded though, because most people locked their doors. From that day I made an effort to avoid Fred and didn't confront him. However, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was trying to open my door. A few times I even got up and looked down the hall. But other nights I just went back to sleep. I never caught him again, but I still wonder how many times he tried when I wasn't awake. This took place in Florida sometime between 2004 and 2006. I was around 7 years old at the time and my sister was a few years older. I am French American and growing up overseas made visiting my grandparents in America a unique experience. They had a neighbor, a very old thin man as far as I can recall, who lived with his wife. We didn't see her often, but sometimes we'd catch a glimpse of her trimming the hedges or staring at my sister while we played in the backyard. My grandparents used to live in a different house just a few houses down from where they currently lived. I always wanted to go back and retrieve some toys I'd left behind at the old house, but I never got the chance. On several occasions the old man would try to get me and my older sister to enter his house. Sometimes he would approach us separately and other times he would try to get us both together. Even as a young child I remember certain details vividly. There was one particular encounter with the neighbor that has stuck with me. On a normal Florida day, I was playing in the backyard and searching for lizards. Pastime, I noticed the neighbor waving at me and hesitated for a moment before walking over. He seemed to gesture for me to come into his garage. Just before I reached him, my older sister appeared behind me, grabbing my hand. She scolded me for almost stepping onto our neighbor property. When I told her what had happened, she glanced at him. The old man began saying strange things like, "Your dog is in my garage, come get her, I have some candy." After a few minutes of this I grew bored and sat down in the grass. I remember my older sister leaning down and whispering something in my ear. When I say so, we run. Got it, I nodded, unsure why we needed to run. As my sister locked eyes with the man, he continued to talk about candy, the dog, and other random things. As he got closer, my sister whispered again, "Now," and we both got up and sprinted back toward the house. The man was shouting after us to come back. Once inside, my sister told our parents what had happened, and they made it clear that we should never speak to the man again. Our dog was safe in the house the whole time. At the time I thought it was just a strange experience and didn't pay much attention to. It wasn't until much later that I realized how serious it could have been. After that, the neighbor kept trying to get me to follow him into his house. Several times I would wander too close while looking for golf balls, always making an arrow. When I was about 9 years old, the man died in 2008. I don't recall the specifics, but it had to do with his heart. At the time, I didn't really care. I was just relieved that he was gone and that my sister and I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. Looking back, I've realized how unnerving it was, but as a child, I didn't give it much thought. I continue to question why he was so eager to have my elder sister and I move in with him, why he lied about the dog, and what he intended to do with us. I moved out of my parents' house a bit later than most. My family had moved to the United States from Eastern Europe when I was a baby, but my parents still held very traditional values. It took my father quite a bit of convincing before he would allow me to leave, especially since I'm a woman. He believed I should stay home longer. That being said, I was 24 when I finally got my own place. I had a steady job, so I was able to afford a decent one-bedroom apartment not far from my parents. It was in one of two identical buildings next to each other near a major bus terminal in our city. Each building had 20 floors and every apartment had a balcony except for the ground floor. My apartment was on the 14th floor, offering a beautiful view of the highway. The balcony was a good size and closed with a metal and glass railing. It connected to my neighbor's balcony, separated only by a concrete wall. What I really appreciated about this place was that there were no other buildings nearby, so I could go out there and not feel like people could see me. During my first week, I introduced myself to some neighbors. Most were young professionals like me, and I made a few friends early on. However, one neighbor gave me an uneasy feeling right from the start. His name was Gary, and he lived right next door to me. He seemed older, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. Gary was about 5 feet 10 inches. And stocky, resembling a football player, though a bit out of shape. He had a short beard and always wore a backwards baseball cap. A bit odd for someone his age in my opinion, but not a big deal. We met for the first time in the hallway outside our apartments. As I mentioned, we were next door neighbors. I quickly got the impression that he was hitting on me, and I'm not the type to think that about everyone. In fact, he asked me out the very first time we met. I politely turned him down, not wanting to make an enemy, especially since we shared a wall. As weeks went by, I kept running into Gary, which was bound to happen since we lived so close. However, it started happening too frequently. It was quite common for me to be waiting for the elevator and Gary would show up right next to me. Maybe it was a coincidence, but I began to suspect he was listening for when I left my apartment, then coming out to catch me in the elevator. I know it sounds a little paranoid, but it gave me the creeps. It wasn't until the following month that things spiraled out of control. One night, I went to bed early, around 9:00 p.m. I fell asleep well before 10 o'clock, but I woke up in the middle of the night, not completely awake but conscious of my surroundings. I felt like someone was watching me in my room, so I sat up, opened my eyes, and looked around, but it was still dark when I woke up enough to realize something wasn't right. I reached for my phone, which had a flashlight app, and turned on the light. I didn't see anything, but as soon as it turned on, I heard someone run away and slam my front door. I'm sure I also heard Gary's door slam after that. Without that evidence, I would have still suspected him. I called my parents and went over to their house that night. After I calmed down, I tried to figure out how he got in, but I can't be positive. But my best guess is that he climbed around the wall separating our balconies and entered through the sliding glass door. I never kept that door locked because it always seemed like no one could access it. Needless to say, I moved out of that place the following day and returned to live with my parents. When I went back with my father to move my belongings after getting married, Gary was nowhere to be found. He must have been too scared to show his face after everything that had happened. My wife and I moved into a modest one-story house on a quiet street. It had 2 bedrooms, and since we were planning to have children soon, the second bedroom was set aside for that. The house was modest, but the lot size was surprisingly good, which was one of the reasons I liked it. The neighborhood was full of trees and plants, and the neighbors were really friendly. At first, we met Jack, an elderly man who lived across the street from us. He was unmarried and lived alone, and I calculated that he was about 65. Jack was of ordinary height and moved with a small slouch that made him look somewhat shorter. He always wore good clothes, almost like a grandpa or a retired professor. He often wore a plaid dress shirt with a cardigan or a sweater vest, sometimes a bow tie. Jack was an intriguing person. He once owned part of a construction company, but later sold his share to a partner and worked at a used bookstore for the next several decades. I admired that about him. There's more to life than money, and if you can, why not do something you truly enjoy? At the time, I was in my mid-20s, so Jack felt almost like a grandfather figure to me. Over time, we became good friends. He often invited my wife and me over for dinner, and in return, we would have him over at our place. One Friday night, we were at Jack's house for dinner, enjoying ourselves. As always, the dinner was still in the oven, so I decided to go to the bathroom before it was ready. I excused myself and walked down the hallway. On my way I passed Jack's office, and out of curiosity I glanced inside. His laptop was open on the desk, turned on. I'm not sure why, but something drew me to it. I looked over my shoulder, and when I was sure no one was watching, I tiptoed into his office and sat down at his desk. Instantly I felt guilty, but I couldn't resist the urge to snoop a little. I started by checking his browsing history, but there wasn't much to see. His activity was clean. However, as I scrolled through his photos, I noticed something strange. There were pictures of the outside of my house, lots of them taken at night. He had hundreds of IMEs from different angles. What was even more unsettling was that in one of the photos, I could make out the silhouette of my wife from behind a curtain. My heart started to race as I kept scrolling. The images became more and more focused on our house, and I knew something was terribly wrong. One photo in particular stood out. The camera seemed to be pressed right against our window. It was the middle of the night, and yet the most chilling image came next. I found a picture of my wife and me sleeping, taken from the foot of our bed. Jack had been sneaking into our house at night all this time. That was enough. I slammed the laptop shut and walked back to the dining room, where my wife was sitting with Jack chatting. She seemed completely unaware of who she was sitting beside. I couldn't even speak. My hands shook as I grabbed her hand and walked out the front door. I didn't even bother putting on my shoes. My wife was confused, but trusted my instinct and followed me. Once we got home, I told her everything, and that night we moved into a motel as soon as we could. We sold the house and never saw Jack again. This was by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. There's no telling how far Jack might have gone if I hadn't found those images on his computer. But thankfully we got away when we did. I always had a strange feeling about my neighbor, whom we'll call Mr. Johnson. He lived a few houses down from mine. When I was growing up, Mr. Johnson lived alone in the largest house on the street, and nobody really knew much about him. He was always quiet and kept to himself, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made me feel very uneasy. I would see him almost every day, but we never spoke. I would estimate that he was around 50 years old, had short gray hair, a mustache, and a limp, though I'm not sure why. It wasn't until I was playing video games in my room, which was at the back of the house, that I realized how creepy he could be. I like to shut out the outside world when I play by drawing my curtains, turning off the lights, and donning a noise-canceling headset. Suddenly, I felt as though someone had entered the house, which was strange because my parents weren't supposed to be home. Until the following day, I was unable to hear anything, but I could feel footsteps moving throughout the house. I was certain that someone had broken in, so I stopped playing my game, removed my headset, and listened intently until the noise stopped. I dismissed it and resumed playing. A short while later, but the footsteps resumed, this time more persistent and stronger, and every step felt like it shook me. The noise seemed to be coming from the kitchen, so I tiptoed out of my room and carefully descended the stairs, peeking around every corner. When I arrived, I noticed that one of the cabinets was open. I knew I had closed it before I started my game, but it was still wide open. My heart pounded as I got to the cabinet, but just as I was about to close it, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing in my kitchen, looking back with a blank expression on his face. I think he must have been intoxicated because he didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there silently. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. Your mom called me and asked if I could check on you, but that was impossible because I was 14 years old at the time, and my mom had left me home alone countless times if she wanted to check on me." I didn't believe him, but I didn't want to start a fight, so I told him I was fine, thanked him, and he turned to leave. But before he did, he looked back at me and said, "See you soon, kid." I was left shaken and disturbed, unable to figure out how he got into my house, and I was certain I had locked the door. I was too terrified to sleep that night, so when my parents came home the following day, I told them everything right away. By the time I was halfway through the story, my dad had already called the police, who promised to look into it. They interviewed Mr. Johnson, but he denied everything, so there wasn't much else we could do. I began to feel like I was going crazy, and there wasn't enough evidence. Over the next few weeks, I barely slept, and every noise made me jump. I went out of my way to avoid seeing Mr. Johnson, but it wasn't easy. One morning, after seeing the security footage, my father called the police, and they were able to arrest Mr. Johnson and search his home, and what they discovered was even more unsettling than I could have imagined. I still don't understand how Mr. Johnson obtained the keys to our home and the homes of many of our neighbors. He was given a prison term, and I haven't seen him since. I still have nightmares about Mr. Johnson and the way he used to stare at me. I left that house as soon as I was old enough, and my parents followed shortly after. It's hard to imagine how much worse things could have gotten if he hadn't been stopped. It was a really close call, and it was by far the creepiest experience I've ever had. I grew up on a farm where my dad was building our house. Since the front door wasn't finished, we didn't have a lock or a doorbell, so we eventually moved into a duplex in town. It had 2 doors at the front, one of which led down 7 steps to our unit, and the other led up 7 steps to the other unit. An elderly woman lived upstairs. I was around 9 years old when I was playing outside after school, and for the first time, we had a lock and a doorbell. I would lock myself out and then ring the doorbell. I did this twice, and amazingly, my mom wasn't upset with me. I was about to lock myself out a 3rd time, but I changed my mind. My mom was at home in the kitchen preparing dinner, which was at the rear of the duplex. What if my mom got tired of coming to unlock the door? At one point, I noticed a green car driving around the block in an odd way. Considering the location and how far out of the way it was, it didn't seem to make sense. The car came from the north, turned west onto our street, past me, then turned north again. It was circling back, moving quickly, and eventually stopped directly in front of our unit alarm. Bells went on off in my head. In a small town, people don't park in front of someone's place unless they belong there, and anyone who did would have parked in the driveway. 2 men got out of the car. One was older, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. The other looked like a young adult or an older teenager. The older man had tattoos on his arms, which was unusual back then. They both rushed toward me the moment I saw their feet touch our grass. I opened the door, ran inside, closed it, locked it, and hurried down the steps. I hid in my bedroom, which was at the front of our unit, and crawled under the bed. I listened closely for any knocks or doorbell rings. Our doorbell was loud, but even the upstairs bell would be audible. I strained my ears, but heard nothing for a few minutes. Finally, I built enough courage to look outside, and they were gone. I didn't tell anyone, and eventually I forgot about it. A year later, we moved to the other side of town into a house. One day my parents and I took a drive around the small town. A common activity in a place like that. We slowly drove through streets, casually exploring. My dad eventually drove past that old duplex we used to live in. He turned onto a main road west of the duplex. The road ran south, but somehow he took a westward turn again onto a dirt road. I didn't know that road existed. It was further west. There were shacks and rundown houses hidden out of sight past the main road. I had no idea this part of town existed. We passed one shack then. Another at the next shack. I spotted the same green car from a year ago. I was so frightened I pressed my body low against the car floor as we passed. Looking back, I realized those men lived there, and they were probably on their way home. If they had been driving along the main road, they would have seen me playing outside my door. I must have looked like I was locked out, ringing the doorbell and trying the lock. They circled back, waiting for an opportunity to make their move. They were likely surprised when I simply walked inside. They weren't visiting the elderly woman because they never returned. That old lady didn't have people with tattoos visiting her anymore. This happened about 20 years ago. My wife and I lived in a peaceful neighborhood with our son Matthew. We knew most of our neighbors. It was one of those places where everyone was friendly and everyone knew everyone's business. There were a lot of kids in the area, some of whom were friends with our son, but there was one kid who caused a lot of trouble. His name was Zach, and he was 10 years old, 1 year younger than my son. Zach was shorter than most kids his age, but he was strong, not fat, but very thick, almost muscular. He was always getting into fights with other neighborhood kids, but he always had an excuse. It seemed that wherever Zach was, trouble followed. The other kids knew about him, but they also saw him as one of the cool kids, so they still wanted to hang out with him. Needless to say, my wife and I didn't like Zach. We were worried about the influence he might have on Matthew. His parents didn't do anything about his bad behavior, so there wasn't much we could do. Things took a terrifying turn one day, though. Matthew came home from playing with his friends, and as soon as he walked into our house, a strong smell hit me. It was unmistakably the smell of gasoline, and it was all over my son. I looked at him and could tell he was distressed. He wasn't crying, but he looked like he was about to. Matthew was scared out of his mind. He stood in the doorway trembling. I got up from the couch, walked over to him, and put my hand on his shoulder. I felt something wet, and when I smelled it, I realized Matthew was soaked from head to toe in gasoline. After he cleaned up, we sat down in the living room, and he told me what happened. Matthew and his friends were walking through the woods when they ran into Zach and a few other kids. Zach had a water jug filled with gasoline, though I never found out why. Somehow Zach poured the gasoline all over Matthew's head, then pulled out a lighter and pretended to light it. The other kids stood in horror, but no one did anything. Eventually Zach let them go, and they all ran home. To me, that went way too far. Up until then, Zach's behavior had been bad, but not out of the ordinary. This incident made me genuinely fear for my son's life. I called Zach's parents, hoping they would take responsibility. But just like before, they didn't seem to care. It was as if they were in denial about what was going on with their son. There was clearly something wrong, but they refused to acknowledge it. I didn't want to call the police, but they left me with no choice. My wife and I decided to involve them because of what he did to Matthew. Zach was sent to a juvenile detention facility. I'm not sure how long he was there, but once he returned home, things only got worse. We frequently saw Zach strolling around our house, pacing the street in front of our house and looking menacingly into the windows. It was obvious that he was trying to scare us. Matthew also told me that he bragged to others at school about how he was going to kill our whole family. Someone must have had a conscience, because eventually a teacher learned of his plans and reported it. The police got involved again, and when they searched his room at his parents' house, they found some very disturbing things. Somehow Zach had managed to get a hold of a gun as well as several knives. They also discovered a journal where he had written down all the things he planned to do to my family. After that, Zach's family moved out of our neighborhood, and that was the last time we saw him. Thankfully, his plans were never fulfilled. A few years ago, I searched his name out of curiosity, and I found some news articles and public records. It turned out that he had been in and out of prison for most of his life with numerous assault and robbery charges. Honestly, I was surprised he hadn't done worse. That kid was seriously troubled, and in my opinion, it's only a matter of time before he does something worse. My name is Josh, and this happened to me when I was in high school around the year 2006. I grew up in a tight-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other. I had a great group of friends, with Andrew being my closest. We also had a few other really good friends. There was only one elementary school and one high school in the area. Since we all attended the same school, we became very familiar with one another. It was an ideal place to grow up, and I cherish those memories. However, everything changed when a new kid moved in a few houses down from mine. His name was Mason, and from the moment we met, I sensed there was something unusual about him. He never smiled, never made eye contact, and always seemed to keep to himself. I know it can be tough being the new kid. My friends and I were already close, so it must have been difficult for him to fit in socially. First, I thought he was just shy, but as time went on, I realized it was something more. Mason was unsettling. There was something about the way he looked at you, like he was evaluating you, deciding whether you were worthy of his attention. It was strange because usually when a new kid comes into the picture, they try hard to be accepted, but didn't do that. I hardly ever heard him speak. The only time I did was in class when a teacher asked him a direct question. I started avoiding him, but at the same time I couldn't shake the curiosity. He was like a puzzle, and I felt compelled to understand him more out of curiosity than anything else. One day I decided to try talking to him. At lunch, I sat down next to him. He always sat alone. I asked him about his family and what he liked to do for fun, anything to get to know him better, but he just stared at me, not saying a word. Felt like talking to a wall. After an uncomfortable silence, I got up and returned to my friends. "How did it go?" Andrew asked. "I don't know," I replied. "Something's off about him." From that moment, my friends and I decided to keep our distance from Mason. I didn't know what was going on with him, but I didn't want to be on his bad side either. We agreed to be polite, but stay away. Over time, strange things began happening. Someone broke into my neighbor's house and stole some money and other belongings. A few days later, there was a fire in the woods near the school. It was clearly intentional, as forest fires never occurred in that area. We all suspected Mason. The teachers and parents wouldn't say it out loud, but they saw him as a troubled young man struggling to fit in, and they didn't want to make things worse. My friends and I knew better, though. We wanted to get to the bottom of it, so we tried searching the internet for news articles or anything related. However, since it was 2006, the internet wasn't as advanced and there wasn't much information available. One evening, while walking home from a friend's house, I heard a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like Mason talking to someone. It was strange since he rarely spoke at all. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the sound and stumbled upon Mason. He was pacing back and forth in the woods, talking to himself in complete nonsense. Fortunately, no one was harmed because Mason's father was awake and was able to get the rest of the family to safety. Shortly after, there was a fire at Mason's house in the middle of the night. The police investigated, suspecting arson, and discovered that the fire was intentionally started. Mason had a large knife in his right hand, so I quickly turned around and carefully left the area. When I got home, I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, thinking I was just making things up for attention. I never saw or heard from Mason again after he was charged with arson and attempting to harm his own family. It was a wake-up call for our community because nothing similar had ever happened to us before. Mason's family moved away shortly after the whispers, and I can't say that I blame them. I tried to find out more about Mason and what happened to him, but I couldn't find anything. Perhaps that's a good thing, and I hope that he has changed his life. My name is Robbie, and I am a 28-year-old man from Central England, UK. In March of last year, I was helping my family build a fence. We were using tools to make sure the fence was sturdy enough to withstand stormy weather, but we had previously had problems with people trying to damage our property even though we had done nothing to provoke them. Perhaps someone had been influencing them, who knows? A young, unruly boy approached us while we were working on the fence, demanding to know what we were doing and threatening to harm us. Our house was semi-detached, with neighbors on either side. There were 3 other semi-detached houses down the road on the right. My brother and I laughed it off and carried on working when the boy approached the road and reached for his pockets. I asked him, "What are you going to do?" And, with adrenaline pumping through my veins, I firmly said, "Move away from our property." I'm not asking again because I have mild traumatic brain injury and PTSD from an incident years ago when a violent person threw a brick at my head without cause. But that's a different story. The boy ran away and came back with his father, who was about 6 feet 3 inches and stocky. He was angry and shouted, "Did you threaten my son?" I denied threatening him and told him to leave our property. My brother and I tried to reason with him, but I don't remember the entire exchange. The father then raised his metal pole toward my neck and placed it firmly but gently there. His eyes had a horrible psychotic expression, and he threatened to cut me to pieces if you ever threatened my son again. I was terrified, my heart pounding like a Ferrari. In my panic, I took a pizza cutter from the kitchen and started swinging it at my brother from the driveway, screaming, "Who are you going to cut to pieces?" He called us liars, so we phoned the police right away. My brother grabbed a drill and turned it on as they ran. One of the 2 armed cops who came with a gun and tasers attempted to console me as the other officers spoke to my brother and mother. He told us that they would look into it while recording a statement on a body camera. I need you to do that because he is obviously dangerous and has the potential to harm others. It was confusing to me that the incident made my PTSD much worse, but I'm thankful to the doctors and nurses who gave me powerful anti-seizure medications once the fence is finished. The officer agreed and said they would send local officers to follow up. 3 days later, the local police came by to talk with us again, but nothing came of the investigation, probably because they couldn't identify the man I suspect was connected to the crazies living in one of the other 3 houses nearby, though they weren't questioned. I plan to move away and install a CCTV system with remote access for any future incidents. My brother may stay behind to support our mom, but as for the crazy asylum dad, I never want to see him again ever. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana. My parents ran a landscaping business, and we lived in a modest house on the edge of town. Our neighborhood was peaceful, and I spent most of my time playing with my friends and helping my dad with his work. One of my dad's employees, lived down the street from us. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with a scruffy gray beard and a belly that stretched his t-shirt. He always smelled of cigarettes and alcohol, and his speech was often slurred. He was never my favorite person, but my dad seemed to trust him, so I didn't question it. Besides, I didn't have to interact with him much since I was usually at school or playing with my friends. But one day things took a darker turn. It was a warm afternoon early in the summer, and I had just gotten home from school. My parents weren't home yet, so I had the house to myself. I was planning to spend the afternoon playing video games and snacking on junk food when there was a knock at the door. I peered through the window next to the front door and saw Al standing there. He looked disheveled, holding something in his hand, a note. Perhaps my parents had always warned me to be cautious about strangers, and he definitely fit the description. Although not technically a stranger, I decided to treat him as one. But then Al spoke, and his voice was slurred and shaky. He called me little buddy as if I were a kid or a pet, and I didn't like that. I tried to be kind and open the door, but I was staring back. I'm not sure why, but I suppose I just lacked the courage to tell him to go since everything was going well. I said, "What do you need?" I inquired, and Al's eyes darted about anxiously as if he was looking for a quick response. "Oh, not much." He said he just wanted to say hello and maybe show you something great, but something about the way he said that didn't set well with me. I wanted to slam the door and call my parents, but I didn't want to take the chance of upsetting him since I knew they wouldn't approve of it, so I tried to sound strong without coming off as hostile. Al's eyes furrowed and he added, "Come on, kid. It will only take a minute." I shook my head, saying, "No, I'm sorry, I can't. Maybe another time." Al stepped toward me as his face became serious. He added, "I think you're going to like what I have to show you, and if you tell anyone I'll make sure you regret it, but I couldn't shut the door if I wanted to listen." He was now halfway inside the doorway. I was panicked and my hands were trembling. I knew I needed to take immediate action. I inhaled deeply before taking out my phone and quickly dialed my dad's number. "Hey Dad," my dad answered, "Stay put," and I said, "I'm on my way." I hung up and turned to face Al, who was now standing completely in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me. "Al's here and he's acting weird. Can you come home?" "What's happening, child? Why are you calling your dad?" he questioned, his tone changing from threatening to almost begging. I stepped back and gripped my phone firmly, saying, "You need to leave." Trying to sound bolder than I could tell from Al's reaction, I replied he spat, twisted into a snarl, and said, "You'll regret this, you and your whole family." He turned and staggered down the stairs, vanishing around the corner of the house. I watched him go, feeling both relieved and afraid. A few minutes later, my dad pulled into the driveway, and I hurried outside to meet him, my legs trembling with relief. "What's going on?" he asked, his face showing fear. I stormed over to Al's house, still in his work clothes and with his heavy boots, and I followed him like a lost dog. I told him everything in a hurry, and my dad listened patiently, his face getting angrier with each word that piece of crap he muttered. I knew he was trouble. Al slurred as we got closer, his face inches from Al's. "You know damn well what I want," he said, holding a beer on his porch. He was so inebriated that he could hardly sit up straight. "What the hell were you doing at my house trying to lure my son away?" he growled. Al's face went slack with surprise. "I wasn't doing anything," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "I just wanted to say hi." My dad didn't believe him. He grabbed Al by the collar of his shirt and pulled him to his feet. "You're done," he said, fired. "If you ever come near my family again, I'll make sure the whole town knows what kind of scum you are." Al stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and falling onto his porch. His beer spilled onto the ground. My dad turned and stormed back toward our house, leaving Al sputtering and cursing behind him. The whole incident really scared me. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if my dad hadn't come home when he did. What if Al had managed to grab me and pull me into his house? I don't even know what that guy was capable of. My dad tried to reassure me, telling me that he would always protect me and that Al was just one bad person in a mostly good town. Still, it was creepy knowing he was so close. For a few weeks after the incident, I didn't sleep well. I kept imagining a lurking outside waiting for his chance, but gradually, as time passed and nothing happened, I began to relax. I still avoided Al whenever I saw him around town, but I didn't feel like I was in imminent danger anymore. A few years later, Al's health declined and he was moved into a care home. I never saw him again. After that, a young family moved into his house, and they were really nice. I kept Al's identity in his attempts to accomplish things. I didn't want people to know a secret. This story took place almost a decade ago when I was in my early 20s. I used to visit my grandmother a few times each year, usually during the summer, because she lived in Minnesota where the winters were harsh. My grandmother lived in a relatively small town, and I always enjoyed the peaceful, quiet atmosphere. Her apartment was in a complex made up of 5 buildings, all 2 stories high. They were arranged in a square shape and faced a large courtyard in the middle which had a swimming pool. I always looked forward to these visits, but one summer things took a frightening turn. It was a sunny day, and I was walking to the local grocery store to pick up a few things for my grandmother. As I walked, I noticed a man from the apartment complex walking behind me. I had only been in town for a couple of days at that point and hadn't seen him before. He seemed new to the area. I tried to ignore him, but every time I glanced back, he was still there, just a few steps behind me. I began to feel uneasy. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something about his presence made me uncomfortable. He was following too closely. I stopped on the sidewalk and stepped aside, hoping he would pass by, but he did the same. He stood there staring at me. My anxiety increased, so I walked more quickly in an attempt to get to my grandmother's apartment, but he remained a safe distance behind me. I was ready to start running when I heard my grandmother's voice calling out from the doorway of her apartment. I turned around, glad to find her standing there, looking sternly at me. The guy turned and went away. I experienced a sense of relief. My grandmother explained that she had seen the man before. He had a reputation for acting strangely and following people. She warned me to be cautious and to stay away from him. Every time I left the apartment, I felt like I was being watched. It seemed he was always nearby. One afternoon, I was walking to a nearby park when I heard someone calling my name. I turned around and saw that man standing just a few feet away, a creepy smile on his face. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. "I have something to show you." I was too scared to move or speak. The man stepped closer, and I could smell the stale scent of alcohol on his breath. "Don't worry," he said in a low, menacing voice. "I won't hurt you." I screamed and ran back to my grandmother's apartment. I told her what had happened, and she immediately called the police. They took my statement, but never followed up. That man ruined my visit to my grandmother's town. The whole time I was there, I felt like he was watching me. As soon as I could, I left town and never looked back. I never wanted to see that man again. Later that year, I spoke to my grandmother over the phone, and she mentioned that the man had been arrested. I never asked her what he did. Truthfully, I was too frightened to ask, and she never shared the details. I can only imagine, since his arrest, I never saw that creepy man again, and my grandmother never brought him up again either. I'm glad it stayed that way. I had just finished college when this happened. My boyfriend and I moved to a new city, into a small, cozy apartment. It was just the right size for the two of us, and we were excited to begin our new life together. I had taken a job at an insurance company, though it wasn't my dream job. My student loans were larger than I cared to admit, so I took the highest paying position I could find. My boyfriend hadn't secured a job yet, but he was actively looking. The building we lived in was older but well maintained, and the neighbors were friendly. It had 5 stories and took up an entire city block shaped like a large U with a parking lot in the center. We lived on the first floor, and our view wasn't great. Fantastic windows facing other flats. After a few weeks, something started to feel strange. One evening while I was preparing dinner, I noticed the blinds in the apartment directly across from ours were slightly open, and a faint silver light peeked through them, almost like a camera lens or binoculars. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but it happened again the following night and the night after. Ours felt like we were on display to the rest of the building from almost every direction. I was first paranoid, but as the days went by, I saw hints of movement behind the curtains, and eventually I started to believe that someone was watching us from that window. My boyfriend acknowledged that it was odd and that we ought to take action, so we made the decision to talk to the landlord about our worries. We explained what we had been going through and asked him if he knew who was residing in the apartment across from us, but the landlord declined to get involved, saying we lacked hard proof and that it was primarily based on our intuition. My boyfriend and I were watching TV late one night when the blinds in the apartment next door suddenly opened, revealing a shadowy figure inside. This was the first time we had ever seen the person who lived there, so we stood by the window and peered through the blinds until the light inside the apartment flickered on and we recognized him. He was about 30 years old, with dark black hair and thick glasses, and his face seemed permanently set in a frown, almost as if he couldn't smile. He was staring at us, and there was no question that he knew we were there. The next night, my boyfriend and I were sleeping in our bedroom next to the window. We always kept the curtains drawn, so when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on the glass, I sat up in bed, my boyfriend still sound asleep, and peeked through the curtains to see that our neighbor was standing there. Dim light from the building fell across half of his face, giving him a truly terrifying appearance. I immediately closed the curtains and grabbed my phone to call the police to report what had happened, but by the time the officer arrived, the neighbor had left, so we filed a report and informed the landlord. The next day was as terrifying as that night was, but in a way, it was a relief. I still don't know what happened to that neighbor, but I think he should have been charged with stalking. We didn't follow through, but it still haunts me. Up until that point, we felt like we were going crazy trying to explain what was happening. After that night, there was no question that our neighbor was a disturbing figure. We packed up and moved to a different part of town shortly after. Our new apartment became a fresh start for us. We were grateful to move past that experience. We paid a bit more to secure a higher floor unit, feeling more secure. Since then we haven't had any issues and we are much happier in our new home. I live in the UK and I used to live on a quiet street that ended in a cul-de-sac. It was one of those streets where there's only one way in and one way out. We had nice neighbors overall, but there was one neighbor who was quite unsettling. He was a builder who lived 3 houses down. He would talk to us occasionally, which was normal, but he also brought wine to our house for him and my mom to share. At the time, my mom was a single parent, and she always declined his offer when he proposed it. She wasn't interested in him. He would give me and my sister advent calendars for Christmas and ask me things like when my birthday was, trying to get closer to us. I was young at the time and I didn't realize how creepy his actions were. What still gives me chills to this day happened on bonfire night in 2017. I was about 9 years old. That evening my sister and I were supposed to visit my dad and spend time with him. That's when the neighbor down the street asked if we were doing anything for bonfire night. My mom didn't see it as a red flag and told him that we were going to my dad's house. That meant my mom would be home alone later that day. I decided to stay with my mom so she wouldn't feel lonely. When night fell, my mom and I went to a friend's house. There were other kids my age there and we got along well. We spent the evening playing and having fun. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, my mom and I returned home and went straight to bed. I woke up to a strange sound, though I wasn't sure what it was. It was still dark outside, making it even more confusing. I opened my bedroom door and saw a figure walking through the house. At first I thought it was my mom because I couldn't see who it was and they didn't react to me when I opened the door. I assumed it was my mom returning from the restroom since the flush of the toilet woke me up. Our home was set up with a bathroom at the top of the stairs, followed by my sister's room, my mom's room, and my room at the end of the corridor. The dark figure walked into my mom's room and left the door open. I waited and watched. Eventually, the figure walked out of her room and down the stairs. Then my mom came out of her room and into mine calling the police. She looked out the window but didn't see anyone. The police arrived within 5 minutes with 2 officers. One was asking questions and the other was checking around the house. The officer inspecting the house mentioned that the back door was broken, likely with a tool like a screwdriver. My mom explained that she woke up to a figure standing over her, thinking it was me, so she said my name. The figure walked out calmly. I think I made the right choice by staying with my mom. If she hadn't thought it was me, something worse might have happened. After that night, our creepy neighbor never spoke to us again. I had my suspicions about him because he was a builder and clearly had access to tools that could break a simple door lock. He acted in a strange manner toward my mom, and since he lived a few houses down, he could have easily fled. Before the police arrived. For that reason, I believe it was probably him. When I was 19, this experience happened to me. After my first year of college, I moved into a house off campus with some friends I had made in the dorms. We decided to rent a house together since we couldn't find a place close to the school. Our neighborhood mostly consisted of families and non-students, which made the house feel a bit out of place for us. The house wasn't the nicest. There were spots where the paint was peeling, but it had a cozy vibe, and we were excited to have our own space. Finishing our first year and stepping into our second felt like a fresh start, and moving into that house felt like a step toward independence. We spent the first few days unpacking and setting up our rooms. I had the good fortune to have the biggest room with a huge window that allowed in plenty of natural light. My roommates and I quickly settled into a routine, going to classes, studying, and spending time together in the evenings. However, something began to feel off. A few houses down, there was a man named Paul who seemed to always be around. He appeared to be at least 35 years old, but acted as though he were our age. He would often be outside when we came or left the house, waving and trying to make small talk. I wasn't upset that he was friendly, but he didn't seem to understand when we weren't interested. One evening I saw him on the street and he asked what I was doing, clearly trying to ask me out. I told him I was busy with school, thinking he'd get the message, but for the next few weeks he kept pressing. No matter how many times I said I wasn't interested, he kept following me, trying to start conversations. One evening when we had a small gathering with some friends, 8 of us total, he showed up uninvited. He had been drinking and acted like he was trying to impress everyone. I wanted him to leave, but I was afraid he might get upset, so I asked my friend Ryan to handle it. Ryan, a 6 feet 4 inches and rugby player, struck up a conversation with Paul, but things soon got out of hand. Paul became enraged and produced a knife. Since there wasn't enough evidence to file charges, Ryan moved away, and one of my friends called the police. By the time they got there, Paul had put the knife away, but we all told them what had happened, and the police believed us, so he was arrested. The following day, Paul returned, and we kept our doors locked and our curtains closed at all times. I even stopped going to class alone and only left when someone could accompany me. I was genuinely scared, but no matter what we did, Paul continued to make us feel unsafe. We saw him outside the house watching us, and he would occasionally make threatening gestures. Eventually, we couldn't live like that anymore. We broke our lease and found a new place to live. It was such a relief to leave the house and that creepy neighbor behind. We were really disappointed that the police couldn't do more. 8 eyewitnesses should have been enough, but for some reason it wasn't. Paul was a dangerous person, and I wouldn't be surprised if he hurt someone else. I couldn't even bring myself to look him up online. Last year, something unexpected happened to my partner and me. We moved into a new apartment together for the first time. It was a fresh start in a new city, and we were excited to begin this new chapter in our lives. The apartment had a modern design with white walls and large windows that allowed in plenty of natural light. Our neighbor Alex was the first person we met in the building. He was tall with short blonde hair and a muscular build. He seemed friendly and greeted the rest of the building with a warm smile. We chatted briefly and he offered to help us with moving, and we politely declined, though we appreciated his offer. Over the next few days, we often saw Alex around the building. He always greeted us warmly and asked how we were settling, and the conversations were light, filled with standard pleasantries. He seemed like a nice person, and we were happy to have a friendly neighbor. However, we started receiving threatening notes slipped under our door. They were written in shaky handwriting, filled with angry and violent messages, many of which were poorly written. Makes both of us frightened. We reported the notes to the building manager, who assured us that he would investigate the matter. We didn't suspect Alex at all. In fact, we couldn't fathom who else could be responsible. The building had decent security, and it seemed unlikely for an outsider to gain access without being noticed. Additionally, there wasn't a clear motive. We got another note a few days later, this time more explicit and threatening, saying that we would regret not leaving the building. We took the new note to the building manager, who directed us to the security office, where they were able to view some footage we were unaware of, showing Alex putting the notes under our door. We were both horrified and terrified. Although we were unsure of Alex's motivations, we felt we had to defend ourselves, so we called the police and gave them the video. Alex was arrested and charged with stalking and making threats. It turned out that he had a history of mental illness and had stopped taking his medication. He had become fixated on us, convinced that we were conspiring against him. His delusions led him to send us threatening notes in an attempt to scare us away. We felt relieved that Alex was no longer a threat, though we felt true sympathy for him. Upon learning about his situation, we chose not to press charges. We saw it as a mental health issue, not a criminal one. After that experience, we never truly felt safe in our apartment again. A few months later, we moved to a different building. It was a relief to start fresh in a new space. I'm a female, and this happened when I was about 12 years old. For some background, I had a neighbor who lived a few streets away from me. For a couple of months, he lived with his dad because he couldn't afford his own place, which wasn't a problem. Life can be tough. However, he began peeking and looking into windows of houses around the neighborhood. The police had been called on him multiple times, and he was arrested several times for smaller incidents. As this continued, rumors spread that he was lurking around the neighborhood, causing parents to hesitate about letting their kids play outside. One day I met him face to face. I was walking home from my grandparents' house with my younger brother, who was 10. They lived within a short walking distance from us, so we walked and talked about our day while my mom drove home ahead of us. We didn't want to ride in the car. We preferred to walk instead. It was a beautiful day, and we enjoyed the fresh air. Once we finally turned the corner to our small cul-de-sac, we saw the man's car drive by, and I whispered to my brother, "That's him." He replied, "No way," being the astute 10-year-old that he was, and he yelled out to the moving car with the windows down, not realizing how dangerous it could be. I gave him a stern look and told him to keep walking, but the man turned his car around and began following us. I saw in shock and screamed, "Run!" and we ran straight into my mom's arms, who was waiting for us in the garage. The man then drove around the cul-de-sac and left, returning the way he had come. That night, we all huddled together, feeling uneasy, wondering if he was lurking around. But as far as we knew, he never returned. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for doing something inappropriate to a woman at a Walmart. It's been a year since then, and he's back in the neighborhood causing trouble again. There have been many rumors about what he's up to, but I'm not sure what's true. I wish this story had a better ending, but here we are always wondering what happened to him, and constantly looking over our shoulders. This happened a few years ago when my wife and I were living in a downtown apartment. Our place was in a modern building with large windows that reached from floor to ceiling, and everything was connected to Wi-Fi, including the appliances. The area had many similar buildings, all very close to each other, so it was easy to see into other people's apartments. If you looked out the window, it was a bit unsettling to be at home and have such a clear view into the lives of others. Unsurprisingly, I kept the curtains closed as much as I could. However, we had several houseplants that needed sunlight, so we had to keep the curtains open sometimes. Though the sunlight wasn't direct, it was enough to keep the plants alive. After a while, we became accustomed to it, so we started leaving the curtains open more often. Felt a little suffocating with them closed all the time. For a while, everything seemed normal, but one evening my wife came home in a state of distress. She was crying and speaking in a rushed, incoherent way. She rushed over to the window and furiously pulled the curtains shut. Despite my attempts to calm her down, she couldn't seem to compose herself. The only words I could understand were that we needed to move. When I asked her why, she kept repeating the same things over and over. After a few minutes, she managed to explain what had happened. She told me that she had received an anonymous email with a link to a website. On the site, there were countless hours of video footage of us at home recorded through the windows. I wanted to see it, but she was hesitant. However, curiosity got the better of me, and we turned on my laptop to check. To my horror, her story was true. Our neighbor had been filming us for months, videos of us sitting at home, watching TV, cooking dinner, and going about our daily lives. After a few minutes, I shut the laptop and walked over to the window. I peeked through the curtains and looked toward the neighboring building. From the video, it wasn't immediately clear where the camera was positioned, but I managed to pinpoint it to a section with 3 or 4 apartments. Then I spotted a glint of a camera lens from one of the neighboring windows that confirmed where the camera was. Knowing where it was, I called the police. We went to the station and filed a report, but it didn't lead to much. The police simply advised us to keep the curtains closed since we knew who was responsible. I found it hard to believe that this didn't qualify as a criminal offense. I should also mention that, although she isn't a huge celebrity, my wife is somewhat of a public figure because she works for the municipal government where we live, and people occasionally recognize her. I suspect that she was targeted because the person filming her recognized her, so it goes without saying that we left that apartment as soon as possible. This happened to me when I was 12, while I was at a friend's house, who we'll call Sam. Looking back, Sam was one of those popular students at school who was constantly getting into trouble. Since I wasn't exactly a member of the cool set, I'm not sure how I was able to maintain our friendship for so long. I didn't know why it was called Mop, but I agreed to play, so we went down to his front yard and looked around the road to see if anyone was approaching. One Friday after school, I stayed over at his house and we decided to play one-on-one soccer in the backyard. After about 20 minutes of play, he asked if I had heard of a game called Mop, which I hadn't, so he explained how it worked. Hide somewhere along the road, and when someone drives or walks by, you shout the word Mop in the hopes of getting a reaction. I didn't think many people would pass by Sam's house because it wasn't on a busy road and there was a patch of woods about 20 houses down. I hid behind the garbage cans near the driveway fence, and Sam was hiding in the garden on the other side. At that time, it was about 4:00 p.m., so it was still daylight, which made the game seem less exciting to me. After about 2 minutes, a car passed by and Sam yelled Mop, but nothing happened, which wasn't surprising because I knew a driver wouldn't be able to hear us. Shortly later, a guy and a woman were on their way by me while walking their dog. The game went on for a while, and I was getting bored. I remember asking Sam a few times if we could stop, but he just laughed and called me a baby because Sam was the cool kid. I didn't want to look like I couldn't handle it, so I kept playing until I saw a homeless man walking down the street. Sam couldn't have seen him yet, so I gave him a signal that someone was coming. He waited until the man got closer, and I noticed that he was talking to himself as if he was having a fight. He looked to be in his 40s, and he was wearing rough, long, greasy hair and had a dirty face. As the guy walked past me, I became anxious. Sam said something out of the blue, "Mop," and then the man turned to face the house. I was furious and afraid that the man might have seen me behind the bins. He began to pace back and forth while muttering to himself and staring at the house. Eventually, he disappeared from view. I went out from behind the bins and approached Sam, but before I could reprimand him for his actions, he said something even more. I wish I could say that we immediately left, but Sam wanted to see where he was going, so we continued. Reckless said, "I know it was a terrible idea, but being an 11-year-old just wanting to fit in, I agreed." We kept our distance from the man, following him towards the entrance of the woods. We hid behind a car and watched him go into the woods. After a few minutes, Sam stopped abruptly and I heard him mutter something to himself. I moved up beside him and, just ahead behind some rocks, I saw the man crouching down and staring directly at us. Before I could react, he got up and ran towards us, screaming like a crazy person. Sam entered first, and I followed closely behind him. The leaves were dry and made a loud crunching sound beneath my feet. Sam and I screamed and ran, fearing that the man would grab me at any moment. Fortunately, the man stumbled and fell, and I felt the air move from inches behind me. I slowed down a little and turned to see him lying flat on the ground, growling angrily. Even though I could no longer see Sam, I kept running. We soon emerged from the trees and began sprinting down the road back to Sam's home, where he was waiting for me when I returned because I could still hear the crunching of leaves and branches. When I was a child, I hadn't even started kindergarten yet, and I lived with my grandparents after my parents separated. My dad worked in the town next door, which was not far, so I got to see him on the weekends. I never talked about that night to anyone, and Sam hasn't either. At 22, I've learned a valuable lesson about respect that guides me every day, and I'm forever grateful that he didn't get the chance. So we started leaving the curtains open more often. Felt a little suffocating with them closed all the time. For a while everything seemed normal, but one evening my wife came home in a state of distress. She was crying and speaking in a rushed, incoherent way. She rushed over to the window and furiously pulled the curtain shut. Despite my attempts to calm her down, she couldn't seem to compose herself. The only words I could understand were that we needed to move. When I asked her why, she kept repeating the same things over and over. After a few minutes, she managed to explain what had happened. She told me that she had received an anonymous email with a link to a website. On the site, there were countless hours of video footage of us at home recorded through the windows. I wanted to see it, but she was hesitant. However, curiosity got the better of me, and we turned on my laptop to check. To my horror, her story was true. Our neighbor had been filming us for months, videos of us sitting at home, watching TV, cooking dinner, and going about our daily lives. After a few minutes, I shut the laptop and walked over to the window. I peeked through the curtains and looked toward the neighboring building. From the video, it wasn't immediately clear where the camera was positioned, but I managed to pinpoint it to a section with 3 or 4 apartments. Then I spotted a glint of a camera lens from one of the neighboring windows that confirmed where the camera was. Knowing where it was, I called the police. We went to the station and filed a report, but it didn't lead to much. The police simply advised us to keep the curtains closed since we knew who was responsible. I found it hard to believe that this didn't qualify as a criminal offense. I should also mention that, although she isn't a huge celebrity, my wife is somewhat of a public figure because she works for the municipal government where we live, and people occasionally recognize her. I suspect that she was targeted because the person filming her recognized her, so it goes without saying that we left that apartment as soon as possible. This happened to me when I was 12, while I was at a friend's house. Who will call Sam? Looking back, Sam was one of those popular students at school who was constantly getting into trouble. Since I wasn't exactly a member of the cool set, I'm not sure how I was able to maintain our friendship for so long. I didn't know why it was called Mop, but I agreed to play, so we went down to his front yard and looked around the road to see if anyone was approaching. One Friday after school, I stayed over at his house and we decided to play one-on-one soccer in the backyard. After about 20 minutes of play, he asked if I had heard of a game called Mop, which I hadn't, so he explained how it worked. Hide somewhere along the road, and when someone drives or walks by, you shout the word Mop in the hopes of getting a reaction. I didn't think many people would pass by Sam's house because it wasn't on a busy road and there was a patch of woods about 20 houses down. I hid behind the garbage cans near the driveway fence, and Sam was hiding in the garden on the other side. At that time, it was about 4:00 p.m., so it was still daylight, which made the game seem less exciting to me. After about 2 minutes, a car passed by and Sam yelled Mop, but nothing happened, which wasn't surprising because I knew a driver wouldn't be able to hear us. Shortly later, a guy and a woman were on their way by me while walking their dog. The game went on for a while, and I was getting bored. I remember asking Sam a few times if we could stop, but he just laughed and called me a baby because Sam was the cool kid. I didn't want to look like I couldn't handle it, so I kept playing until I saw a homeless man walking down the street. Sam couldn't have seen him yet, so I gave him a signal that someone was coming. He waited until the man got closer, and I noticed that he was talking to himself as if he was having a fight. He looked to be in his 40s, and he was wearing rough, long, greasy hair, and had a dirty face. As the guy walked past me, I became anxious. Sam said something out of the blue, Mop, and then the man turned to face the house. I was furious and afraid that the man might have seen me behind the bins. He began to pace back and forth while muttering to himself and staring at the house. Eventually, he disappeared from view. I went out from behind the bins and approached Sam, but before I could reprimand him for his actions, he said something even more. I wish I could say that we immediately left, but Sam wanted to see where he was going, so we continued. Reckless said, "I know it was a terrible idea, but being an 11-year-old just wanting to fit in, I agreed." We kept our distance from the man, following him towards the entrance of the woods. We hid behind a car and watched him go into the woods. After a few minutes, Sam stopped abruptly and I heard him mutter something to himself. I moved up beside him and, just ahead behind some rocks, I saw the man crouching down and staring directly at us. Before I could react, he got up and ran towards us, screaming like a crazy person. Sam entered first, and I followed closely behind him. The leaves were dry and made a loud crunching sound beneath my feet. Sam and I screamed and ran, fearing that the man would grab me at any moment. Fortunately, the man stumbled and fell, and I felt the air move from inches behind me. I slowed down a little and turned to see him lying flat on the ground, growling angrily. Even though I could no longer see Sam, I kept running. We soon emerged from the trees and began sprinting down the road back to Sam's home, where he was waiting for me when I returned because I could still hear the crunching of leaves and branches. When I was a child, I hadn't even started kindergarten yet, and I lived with my grandparents after my parents separated. My dad worked in the town next door, which was not far, so I got to see him on the weekends. I never talked about that night to anyone, and Sam hasn't either. At 22, I've learned a valuable lesson about respect that guides me every day, and I'm forever grateful that he didn't get the chance. I started crying, breathing heavily, and covered in sweat. I was seldom left alone at such a young age since my uncle, who was my dad's brother, also lived with us. I was trained not to open the door for strangers if I was at home by myself. I grew up in a tiny town where everyone knew one another's names and life was quiet. One neighbor, David, would come over often to watch hockey night in Canada, family picnics, and other activities. I can't recall his real name, so we'll stick with David. Was friends with both my grandpa and my uncle. He'd share beers with my uncle while watching hockey and help my grandpa with yard work or working on the truck when my grandpa returned from hunting. If he managed to catch a moose, they'd unload it from the back of the truck into the shed. One evening I was home alone for a short time. Grandma went to bingo and Grandpa called to say he'd pick her up. I was watching cartoons, so I didn't want to go with him. He told me he'd be back soon and reminded me not to open the door for strangers. I remember hearing the truck start and seeing its headlights pull out of the driveway. Then he was gone. Just a few minutes later there was a knock at the door. I rushed to the front of the house and asked, "Who is it?" David's familiar voice replied, "It's David," I said through the door. "Grandpa and Grandma aren't home right now. I just saw your grandpa's truck drive away," he said. "My uncle isn't home either," I responded. I know I was speaking to him on the phone. "He's at another friend's house drinking beer. Can I come in?" David insisted I'm not allowed to open the door for strangers. I told him I'm not a stranger. He said, "I'm your neighbor. You know me. Let me in." He was right. I did know him. He was a family friend who lived next door. It didn't occur to me at the time why he would want to visit. When my uncle and grandpa weren't home, I unlocked the door and opened it for David. I remember him towering over me as I looked up. He was drunk. I could tell by the way he talked and how his upper body swayed. He squinted with one eye. He stepped inside, and I moved back quickly to avoid being stepped on. He placed his hands on my shoulders. There weren't any alarms going off in my head yet. I had seen my uncle drunk before. I told him to come in and wait in the kitchen if he wanted. Then I planned to return to watching TV, but he wouldn't let go of my shoulders. I tried grabbing one of his hands to free myself, but it was futile. I don't remember what he was saying, but I could hear the anger in his voice and fear began to rise within me. He dragged me into the kitchen and grabbed a large knife. "Do you want to get stabbed?" he asked as he poked me with the knife on my stomach. I began to cry out in fear. "Shut up," he told me, "or I'll cut out your tongue or slice your throat." I felt the cold steel of the knife as he faked slicing my throat to show me he wasn't joking. The next moment, I heard the sound of the truck pulling into the engine shutting off and doors opening and closing. Relief washed over me, knowing help was just seconds away. I was about to yell for help when he covered my mouth to silence me. He turned us towards the door. I saw it open and my grandma entered the house. Her smile faded instantly when she saw David holding me hostage with a knife. She screamed for my grandpa to get inside immediately. My grandpa was always a big and strong man. He rushed in, his voice booming. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. As he looked at David still holding me hostage, I remember seeing the rage and hatred in my grandpa's eyes as he approached David. His voice was still loud as he yelled, "What do you think you're doing?" He advanced toward David in full attack mode. I was unable to see what was happening, but I could hear the struggle in the kitchen as my grandpa was victorious. At last, I was able to look up as he pushed David out the door and slammed it shut, saying, "Never come back here again, you son of a." I don't really know what his motivations were, but when my grandpa's truck drove away, he probably noticed my uncle wasn't home and maybe knew my grandma was at bingo that night too. I was a little boy when I was sitting with my grandma after his funeral after graduating from high school, and I told her about the hero he was that night. She looked a little nervous as she recalled the story, saying it was a very scary night. She mentioned that my grandpa went hunting that night, which I vaguely remembered he occasionally did that for camping trips, but it wasn't a regular activity. She didn't remember much else, and she wondered why he had gone out, which led me to believe that they never charged David. I never saw him again. My name is Perry, and I grew up on the outskirts of a busy city. It felt like a small town even though it was part of a larger area. I knew almost everyone in the neighborhood, even those without children my age. I only later realized that this wasn't typical. Twice a year, we held neighborhood parties, one for Christmas and another for the summer. The streets were wide and lined with large trees, mostly oak and maple, on one side, and on the other side was a highway, which dampened the atmosphere a little, though the noise wasn't awful. People didn't lock their doors because everyone looked out for one another. One of my neighbors, Carrie, was older than me. She was about 17 when I was 11, and she and her older sister, Claire, used to watch me when I was younger. We were close for a while because I was an only child and I loved having them around, but she went through a rebellious phase where she distanced herself from me. I overheard my parents talking about rumors about her, and our neighborhood parties were well known with them. Because of its large main floor and full basement, which can accommodate at least 40 people, the All Twins home is often used for gatherings. The story takes place during the 2011 Christmas party at the All Twins house. We arrived at around 6 p.m., and as usual, my parents mixed with the other kids while I joined them in the living room to play Super Smash Bros. On the GameCube, a game I was completely enamored with at the time. After an hour, I got up to see what else was going on, and then the front door swung open, and Carrie entered. I felt a little uncomfortable around her because we used to be so close, and her new boyfriend Brad stood next to her. He was tall, probably about 6 feet 3 inches, muscular, with short brown hair and a patchy beard. His demeanor annoyed me, even though he didn't look bad for his age. As soon as they walked in, I could tell they were intoxicated. Even at 11, it was obvious I probably only recognized it from movies and TV shows. I felt uneasy and went back to playing video games. I had seen him a few times before, but I didn't like him. Shortly after I heard a fight start, Carrie and her father were shouting at each other in the kitchen. Her father was attempting to defuse the situation, perhaps out of embarrassment, but Carrie was acting aggressively, so things just became worse. Brad couldn't help but glance over again as he participated in the yelling and stretching the bounds. They were in the kitchen, a large open area where everyone could see them. I was shocked when Brad took a folding knife out of his pocket and opened it, even though he didn't point it directly at anyone. In an instant, Car's dad lost it, and he and Brad screamed at each other with a ferocity I had never witnessed before. It was obvious that he thought Brad had corrupted his daughter. Then, Mrs. Alwyn became agitated and shouted that she was contacting the police, which apparently deterred them. Carrie and Brad left the house quickly after Mrs. Alwyn gathered GED, telling us kids that the party was over, understandably, so my parents and I went home. The following morning, a police officer knocked on our door. I watched from around the corner as my dad spoke to him, but I couldn't hear what they said. After the officer left, I was too afraid to ask my dad for details, so eventually the truth came out. For the next few days, our street was filled with police cars, which was an unusual sight as we rarely saw them in our neighborhood. I wasn't interviewed, but some of my friends told me that Brad was found dead in the small wooded area near my house. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia, but there were signs of injuries from a possible fall. It's easy to imagine Brad tripping and passing out from his level of intoxication, but I've always wondered if something more happened after the party. Some of the more conspiracy-minded neighbors believe that Carr's dad may have been involved. In the early years of my first marriage, my then-husband Daniel and I lived in a small apartment with 3 floors and a basement. It was a dreary and terrible place with a serious rat and mouse problem, and I had only been down there out of curiosity. The only reason anyone else would go down there was to tend to the furnace through the fuse box. It would have been nice if they cleaned the place and added a laundry room, but that never happened. We used a laundromat down the street, which wasn't the most glamorous establishment, but it was adequate while we worked on our careers. Even though the pay wasn't fantastic, Daniel's recent graduation from a local community college's accounting program and his first job were significant milestones for us. Meanwhile, I was wrapping up an internship in a physical therapy program. I thought our apartment was on the 2nd floor, and we had a few neighbors, most of whom we didn't even know. The other tenants on our floor kept to themselves and were all very quiet, with the exception of our upstairs neighbor, Claude and Celia, who frequently argued verbally but never physically, because Daniel was very calm and serious, spoke with purpose, and never minced words. Once you got past his tough outer shell, though, he was really sweet and caring, and I think he felt the same way about me. We would occasionally pass each other in the hallway and strike up a conversation, maybe because I was afraid of a fight breaking out and didn't want to get into that. We never bothered to complain about them, even though the noise was a real annoyance. It just didn't feel like our place to get involved, even though in hindsight I know we should have. Claude was older, about 35, and Celia was probably my age, was 23. We were not startled when the shrill sound of a woman's scream pierced our ears one night because the walls were thin enough that we could hear even light conversation, though we usually couldn't make out the actual words because they were always muffled. It seemed like once or twice a week we would wake up to yelling from upstairs. When Daniel and I both jumped out of bed at the same time, I initially thought it was the fire alarm, but when I woke up, I saw it was another fight between the couple upstairs. By that point, we had heard dozens of fights, but this one was different. The screaming was higher, but oddly, it seemed to be very one-sided. Claude seemed to be attempting to defuse the situation by remaining calm while Celia was yelling. Since I couldn't understand much of the words, I could only infer it from the tone. At one point, I considered calling the police, but Daniel intervened. Calmly, "Go back to sleep, it's not our place." I didn't like his tone, but I grudgingly backed down. The yelling went on for a few more minutes, then there was a loud thud and a crash on the floor like someone had just dropped a ton of bricks. After that, there was silence. "How can I go back to sleep? Do you hear this?" I shot back, "Listen, we've heard all this before, just let it go." I was shocked by Daniel's coldness. There was no way he didn't hear what I heard. I got out of bed and searched the room for my phone because I couldn't let this pass before I had a chance to call him. Daniel was lying motionless on his back with his eyes closed. I knew he couldn't be sleeping, but I said, "Did you hear that it stopped? Now go back to sleep." I heard police sirens getting louder. Then I heard the door of our building open and several people entering and stomping up the stairs. I figured someone else must have called, so I sat on the end of my bed and buried my head in my hands. After about 30 seconds, I looked over at Daniel and he was just lying there seemingly asleep. I couldn't understand how this situation didn't bother him more. I knew he heard what I heard, so how could he be so cold? My attention soon turned back upstairs. I could hear that others had entered the place upstairs, and as soon as they did, the woman's scream started again. It was Celia, which meant Claude must have been the one hurt. I also found it odd that the screaming only started again when the police or paramedics arrived, or whoever it was. I then got up and looked up the window. There was an ambulance parked in front of the building. The flashing lights were still on, and I noticed a stretcher being wheeled out to the back of the ambulance. I'll never forget what I saw on the stretcher. It was Claude, and he was badly beaten. I couldn't understand how he looked so bad at that moment. However, I didn't know what was more disturbing, the event itself or Daniel's indifference to it. Was crystal clear that we had just witnessed a crime. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping in my own bed that night, so I went out to the living room and tried to sleep on the couch. I must have drifted off at some point, because I remember waking up in the morning. Daniel was sitting in a chair in front of the couch. He was looking at me as if he was waiting for me to wake up. His legs and arms were crossed, and there was a serious look on his face. I sat up on the couch and looked at him. He said, "I don't know what you think you heard last night, but if anyone asks, we were asleep. What I heard at all, why would I say that?" I asked. "It's just not our place to get involved," he added. His expression was very serious and cold. I was beyond creeped out at this point. There was something going on with Daniel, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I agreed not to tell what I'd heard that night, but I couldn't understand why I was so suspicious of Daniel that I decided to dig deeper. Later that night, I went through his phone while he was in the shower after work. I took it out of his pocket. It was password protected, but I knew the code, so I entered it and started snooping. It wasn't long before I found messages between him and Celia. They were having an affair. It was all in plain sight, but I hadn't seen it. I moved out of the apartment immediately and stayed with my parents for a while. We divorced soon after. I found out later that Claude died, and it was ruled an accident, but I don't believe it. I think Celia murdered him and Daniel had something to do with it. Even though I can't prove anything, that's the only thing that makes sense. If that's true and Daniel inspired to kill Claude, then was I next?